Thank you, Jessica and Jim. It has been an honor to be part of the governor's scientific task force over the last couple of years. I ended up actually coordinating a whole lot of the post-fire response in Western Oregon right after losing my own house to the holiday farm fire. So this has been quite a journey for a lot of reasons to end up here in front of you today. So moving on, there is a change to the agenda. Fires in Western Oregon might be the new normal, but another new normal is COVID. Our tribal partner who was scheduled to speak for us this morning came down with COVID, as well as the backup person. So this happened late yesterday, and we've made some adjustments. Fortunately, we knew Andrew Merschel, who was going to give a flash talk later this morning, and we've bumped him up here to the front of the agenda, which actually I think is a lot more appropriate and gives him more time. He has a story to tell about 800 years of fire here in Western Oregon. I've seen his talk a couple of times. I think it's personally kind of riveting, takes you back and forward and back and forward. And I told you earlier, science delivery, you might feel like you're in a fire hose, so hold on to your socks. It's going to start, but I think Andrew is a really good person to start it with. So Andrew is a postdoc with the PNW Research Station, also working with Oregon State University. So help me welcome Andrew.
Well, I want to start by saying thank you guys all for joining me today, and I want to talk about why I wanted to be part of this symposium. I think we have an opportunity to learn a lot more about the fire regime in Douglas-fir forests in Western Oregon and Washington. I think a lot of what I hear about the fire regime is that it's an infrequent, high-severity fire regime. The reason why I think we're focused on that is because these are very extensive forests. They cover a huge area. And these forests develop over many centuries. So in our lifetimes, it's really hard to get a full and robust picture of the complete fire regime. And our ideas about the fire regime are often dominated by our large, infrequent, high-severity fires that are really seared in our minds. So for example, the Tillamook burn, the Yakult burn, and then of course the 2020 fires. So what I'm going to do today is try and provide us with a richer understanding of the variability present in fire regimes in West Side forests by taking you back through some tree ring data. So beyond these high severity events that are infrequent in part of the regime, these forests have centuries worth of information about fire and forest development that I think we should incorporate into our understanding. So I want to start off by talking about the enormous amount of vertical and horizontal diversity that's found in our old growth Douglas-fir forests. So this is a stand on the Willamette National Forest at about 4,500 feet of elevation. It's sort of a classic picture of diverse late seral habitat in the Douglas-fir zone. And so we have our pioneer cohort of old growth Douglas-fir with the really complex canopies reaching up tall and making that upper canopy layer. We have secondary cohorts of western hemlock and Douglas-fir in the stand. We have our deadwood, our snags, and our logs. And then we have these horizontal canopy gaps. So my question and what I'm addressing here today is how did this type of structure develop over time, and how does it vary across the region? So is there one recipe, or are there many different recipes that old growth forests can follow to develop, and how does fire fit into that? So you've probably all seen this figure. I want to start by saying it's been tremendously important to conservation and protection of old growth forest habitats in the Pacific Northwest. And it's basically saying that our old growth structure and composition, this vertical and horizontal complexity that's found in our old growth stands, is a function of time. So we have a high severity fire. After that high severity fire, a Douglas-fir cohort initiates. Those Douglas-fir trees grow up and they start competing with each other. We go through a stem exclusion phase. Trees start to die. We start to get understory reinitiation. And this process continues until we develop that very diverse, rich, old growth forest structure. What you don't see in here is interruptions by low and moderate severity fire as this happens over several centuries. This model is correct. It absolutely occurs in the Pacific Northwest, but I think there's a wide variety of fire regimes and successional processes that also should be included in our models for Douglas-fir forests. So I've been sort of teased about this, and people say, you know, people don't all think that it's high-severity fire and infrequent fire that dominates this region historically, but I actually see examples of it all the time in abstracts, papers, and the models we're using for fire regimes. So this is a paper by Stevens et al. From 2020. It's a really good paper. They had a novel approach to mapping fire regimes. What they did is they took the major conifers across the western U.S. and they gave them fire resistance scores. So they looked at their adaptive traits to fire. And then they mapped those fire resistance scores across the Pacific Northwest. And they got really hung up on this finding that the forests in western Oregon, western Washington, and the Coast Range have really high fire resistance scores, but the fire regime model is saying that it's an infrequent high-severity fire regime. So they're resistant forests, yet they have adaptations that don't apply to the fire regime model that's being mapped. So the model is stating that the fire return interval is 300 to 500 years, and that the stand replacement portion of fire is 94%. So it sort of makes us wonder why we have this tree species that's the backbone of forest in the Pacific Northwest that is tremendously fire resistant. It develops very fire resistant bark, it self-prunes. Why does it have all these adaptations to low and moderate severity fire if it's not part of what it does? I kind of like to think of Douglas-fir in our region in the Pacific Northwest as the Swiss Army knife of species in terms of adaptations to fire. It can do it all. It can survive a frequent low-severity fire regime, a moderately frequent mixed-severity fire regime, or it does well with high-severity infrequent fire, right? So that sort of implies that this region we're working in has a large mixture of different fire regimes rather than one. Sorry about that. So now I'm going to move into our current research. What I'm showing you here is a map of fire reconstruction sites that we've developed over the past 6 years. These sites started in the Umpqua National Forest in the lower fork of the middle fork of the Willamette River, and then we extended them through the West Side Fire Project all the way up into the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. So we're sort of covering the Western Cascades. More recently, we put in a gridded sample on the Elliott State Forest, and we've moved into the Coast Range. I want to talk a little bit more about where we're sampling today. And so this is a figure showing you temperature and precipitation. So it's showing you the environmental space for places where climates have been sampled across Western North America. This next figure here shows you a density of temperature and precipitation regimes in Western North America. So this is basically the climate space for fire in Western North America. This next group of triangles on the slide is showing you previously published fire histories across that climate space. And so these are from the North American Fire Science Network. And what you see is that most of our fire science today comes out of areas that are relatively hot and dry. We haven't done a lot of fire research where we're actually getting fire years and understanding fire regimes in the moist forests. And so this is where our current sample sits. And what I'm trying to display here is that we're really in new territory for understanding fire regimes with dendroecology and reconstructing fires from fire scars. This is totally new, so as we learn more, I think it's expected that we're going to challenge some of what we've thought in the past. Okay, now I'm going to jump right into how we do this work and results. This is just a photos of Sky, Anna, and Micah in the field. What we do is we identify a clear cut that's next to an existing old growth stand. We go into that clear cut and we blow the tops off the stumps. We remove cross sections from the stumps, and then we take them back to the lab and finish them. This is just a photo showing you an example of cross sections collected at one site on the Santiam River, and you can see that these samples at this particular site contain lots of fire and really good records of historical fires. So for example, that's a fire scar, that's a fire scar. Anywhere you see pitch and a crack on these samples is a fire scar. I want to also emphasize that we are 100% sure that each one of the injuries we're calling a fire scar on these trees is an injury from fire. Trees have all sorts of injuries, but a fire scar is quite distinctive. Fire scars form when a fire burns across a base of the tree. It doesn't physically burn the tree, it heats through the bark, and it kills the cambium just on one portion of the tree bole. And so that's what happened here. The cambium was killed by heating, and you see this very characteristic clean wound that just is arranged along one cell layer there. You also see the curl over on top of that wound. That's like a scab where the tree is healing over the fire scar. And last, you see this very distinctive resin that's much darker that occurs just where the cambium was killed. So we're only using direct evidence of fire to reconstruct fire. We cross-date every single ring on every single tree so we can apply the exact year of fire to each one of these injuries. And that allows us to look at things like fire frequency, fire extent, and how fires are related to climate. So it's a whole new world for understanding fire. I'm now going to move into some results at individual sites. And my goal here is going to be to just show you the variability in fire history that we're finding. Before I do that, I want to explain what I'm going to show on graphs. Each tree that we've sampled is going to have a circle representing its pith date or establishment year. Each fire scar is going to be represented by a triangle, and each tree is going to get its own timeline that extends from its earliest year out to its outermost year that we've sampled. So this is an example of that data for one site on the Willamette National Forest. This site burned at high severity around 1775. A new cohort of Douglas-fir established, and then it reburned in 1812. So that's an example for one site. I'm going to move into a site now that's in the silver fir zone. It's at about 5,000 feet. This is relatively high, cool, and wet among the places we've been studying. And here's the fire and development history for this stand. So we focused sampling on Douglas-fir in this first effort. And what you can see is that there's a stand replacement or high severity fire around the year 1275. So late 13th century, this burned at high severity, a Douglas-fir cohort established, and we only find evidence of one fire in 1493. So this stand really fits the model of infrequent high severity fire. So we definitely find that, but there's a lot of other histories that we find out there. Next, moving on to something at the opposite end of the spectrum. This is a site that's just east of Detroit. It burned at high severity in the 2020 fires. They did some roadside salvage, and that gave us an opportunity to sample very fresh stumps and develop a fire record at this site. So how did old growth develop in this setting versus the last setting? So this is the development history for this site 71. I want to point out to start that this has 3 different cohorts of Douglas-fir that have established over time. The first established right around 1640, probably after a stand replacing fire. There's then several reburns of this site within its first 100 years of development. Another cohort established. There's more fires and a third cohort established. One thing you'll notice right away is the rate of fire at this site is quite high. So this is a site that had frequent or chronic fire historically. It's quite different than the last site I presented. Showing you a little bit more variability, I'm going to go to the site in the western hemlock zone that I started out talking about its vertical and horizontal complexity and how did it arrive over time, and here's the record for that. So this site experienced high severity fire sometime after 1550. The pioneer cohort of Douglas-fir established, and then within about its first 100 years of development, it burned another 3 times. So that's one behavior that we see quite commonly. After a high severity fire, you often see reburns during the early development of the stand. What I want to point out here is this sort of erratic pattern or interval of fire over time. So we experienced that third fire, and then we have about a 150-year period with no fire. So we go from having lots of fire to no fire for a century and a half. So we have erratic fire return intervals in these sites, and we think that may be a function of how the fire environment or local microclimate changes as these forests develop. So they're more flammable when they're young. As you develop a mature forest canopy, they become less flammable. Another note here, we see a pretty common pattern where we see more fire in this period, a gap without fire, and then fire again in the 1800s. So this site burned again in 1812 and 1849. So that was a tour of 3 sites to just give you guys a little bit of an idea of the variability in fire history that we're seeing. And now I'm going to really scale that up to the Willamette National Forest. So the dots here on the page are showing you 24 sites where we've created fire records on the Willamette. And the point of showing you these, sorry, it's the fire hose of information, but it's to show you the tremendous variability in historical fire regimes that occur within a relatively small area in our west side Douglas-fir forests. Okay, so here's our 24 sites. For example, Site 92 is one site, Site 82 is one site, and they're all lined up here. You can see that we have sites that burn really frequently historically, and we have sites with very little evidence of fire for several centuries. So we have tremendous variability in historical fire. We have lots of different age classes. What we're not seeing is one uniform picture of infrequent high-severity fire. Instead, we're seeing lots of different fire regimes in this region. This brings me to some work by Alan Tepley, so I think he was onto this. Alan created lots of stand development histories by coring trees, and he noticed that there were very distinct tree development patterns in different sites, and he hypothesized that was attached to different patterns of fire. So he had sites that clearly developed from infrequent stand replacement fire, chronic fire, and this sort of moderately frequent with non-stand replacing fire being a really important part of the development. The important conclusion here is that we have different old growth types as a function of fire in the region, and that's not only true for old growth. If we think about early seral forest, mid-seral forest, all the way to old growth, fire is doing something to create different structures, different compositions along the way. So it's important to have an understanding of the variety and variability that's out there. I'm going to finish just by stepping into the Coast Range here. What we're finding, this finding that there's a lot of diversity in the fire regime isn't just on the Willamette where we have lots of lightning. We're seeing it in the Mount Hood, other areas, and now in the Oregon Coast Range. So this is a total of 9 sites sampled on the Elliott State Forest and around the Elliott State Forest. And what I want you to see here is the diversity in stand ages that we're picking up, and also the enormous amount of fire that we're actually seeing in a place that's relatively close to the ocean. So we've long thought about these forests in many cases as places where fire is an occasional visitor, but we need to remember that these are seasonally dry forests. They are temperate rain forests. That means they have lots of fuel production. Fuel is not limiting, but they always have a dry season. So they have sort of the perfect recipe to burn, and they did burn quite frequently historically in many cases. I'm going to wrap up with some takeaways. First is that complex habitat and old growth structure is possible not because of the absence of fire, but probably because of non-stand replacing fire in parts of the region. And I say parts because the high severity infrequent fire regime is part of the recipe, but in some cases our old growth is a product of fire. Another way to think about this is it's not just time since fire, it's time and fire that develops these forests. Next point, we have non-deterministic succession. That means that you may have a stand develop one way because it's affected by fire and climate in one instance on a site, and in its next iteration after high severity fire, it may go a different way because the pattern of fire might change over the centuries. Related to that, there are many old growth development pathways, so there's not just one. I have some photos here displaying some different ones with very different endpoints. One on the Umpqua National Forest showing chronic fire. Another one here showing the pattern of frequent fire early in development followed by a reburn in the 1800s. The canopy of hemlock here in the understory is the result of a burn in 1849. So the way this stand got its multi-layered structure is actually through fire. Lastly, a picture of a forest that's been developing for 130 years and has not had fire in it yet. Last point, I think really important as we're thinking about the 2020 fires, fire frequency is non-stationary and reburns are common. So we can't really apply a fire return interval in these forests because it varies over time. Specifically, we see more frequent fire when forests are young, If we think about microclimate in early seral environments on the west side, you're going to have higher temperatures, lower humidity, higher wind speed, and fuels that are flashier and more flammable. And so it makes sense that we might see reburns in our 2020 fires in early seral forests. So fire frequency is not stationary over time. And beyond the tree ring work, we have lots of examples of this. So the Tillamook fire, big east wind event, is followed by lots of reburns afterwards. Same thing with the Yakult fire. You have your initial high severity event, and as the new forest developed, there's lots of smaller reburns within that fire perimeter. I'd like to finish up by thanking everybody who's worked really hard in the field and the lab, acknowledging our support from the Forest Service and also from the College of Forestry. That's all I have. Okay, happy to take a few questions. I'll try and repeat them into the microphone, or you guys can grab a microphone.
Did you see any possible other explanatory variables as to why some areas seem to have more frequency than others? I mean, was there anything you explored there?
Yeah, that's the phase that we're in right now. The question is, are you seeing patterns to these different fire regimes and where they sit on the landscape? I've definitely seen patterns, but we haven't finished that part of the analysis, so I don't want to go too far. But I kind of alluded to the patterns we are seeing. When you're at lower elevations next to major river corridors, you often find that pattern of frequent or chronic fire. As you move into the silver fir zone, it operates in the way you expect, where you see a lot less fire up in that area. But I think the point is to remember that these forests are extending from 1,500 feet to 5,000 feet, and there's tremendous variability in the fire environment over that range. So yes, that's our next step for this work. Garrett?
Really good stuff, Andrew. I'm just curious, how do you think about the role of indigenous burning if there's more frequent fire in the valley bottom, and what does that mean for contemporary cultural burning?
I think it means we're going to need to engage. Okay, so the question is how does indigenous burning in the lower valleys fit into our understanding of fire regimes in the Western Cascades and what we do going forward? I think it's not just isolated to those lower river valleys. We've also seen sites up in the western hemlock zone that appeared to have been frequently burned and tended by cultural burning. We don't know very much right now is the answer. We're just sort of uncovering the evidence through tree rings today. I think the important step is to engage and learn more about traditional burning and where it would be helpful, and start building those relationships, because this is kind of sterile tree ring science, and we don't know a lot yet.
The slide where you showed the injuries to the cambium, indicating several fires on one tree, and that slide they were all on the same side of the tree. Is that something you commonly notice? And what side is that on? Does it have to do with aspect or slope, or why is that injury commonly on the same side of the tree if it is?
Yeah. That's a great question. So the question's about the morphology of fire scars on these trees. They tend to form along one axis. I think that's because the bark is weakened there, and you'll also have resin on that part of the tree. So when a fire comes along, it'll burn that resin, heat through the weak part, and the scars will just stack up there. So we call those recorder trees. When you're on a steep slope, they tend to be on the uphill side of the tree because the fire burns upward and it sort of makes a funnel there. But we've been recording the direction of fire scars, and we found that it's really erratic. So it seems like fire came from different directions, and it had different amounts of fuel on the trees, and I think it really matters where the first scar forms, and the later scars will form in that same spot. Kenny? That's a great question. I did that analysis for the fire history data out of the, how is fire related to climate, I think is Kenny's question here. I did that analysis for the data from the Umpqua National Forest, and I was really surprised to find that there were not strong fire-climate relationships in the Umpqua National Forest. If you do this work on the east side in dry forests, you find that fires are absolutely related to climate. You have a hot, dry year, that's when you have big fire events. We're not really seeing that with our west side fire studies. If you look at fire synchronicity across all those sites, you see very little of it. So what we're sort of thinking that means is that historically on the west side you had lots of smaller fires, maybe 5,000 to 10,000 acre fires that were putting the low and moderate severity fire into these forest systems, and then the bigger stand replacing fires that are harder to catch with our sampling are outside of that.
Great talk, Andrew. Thanks so much. I was curious about whether you were able to collect scars from fire-specific species, and those really indicate from Douglas-fir.
We're able to get, sorry, excuse me. Were we able to use any other species for fire scars? We were able to get good fire scars out of incense cedar, western red cedar, sugar pine. Occasionally you can get one out of a hemlock, but it kind of isn't worth your time because you can develop a much better record out of the other species. So they will form fire scars, but the species are harder to cross-state and they fall apart, so we really just focus on Douglas-fir. One more question. So the question is how does our ability to reconstruct fire change as we move into the higher elevation systems where the species that we rely on for fire history may not be present? I think that thus far we've always stuck to areas where we had Douglas-fir, even if they were pretty rare to make these fire records. I do suspect that in the silver fir zone and parts of the western hemlock zone that are wetter, we're missing evidence of fire. It's certainly easier to do this at lower elevations than it is at higher elevations. You have less rot, you have better recording trees. The process of fire scarring sort of depends on fires coming through, so we could be missing some of the fire events at higher elevations for sure. Thanks, everyone.